Welcome to part 1 of Pride and Prejudice, Reimagined. Today, we take the classic book and reimagine it in the style of best-selling romance author Carolyn Brown.
Pride and Prejudice is a novel by Jane Austen, first published in 1813. It's one of the most beloved works in English literature, known for its witty and insightful exploration of the manners and mores of the society of its time. The story is set in rural England and revolves around the relationship between Elizabeth Bennet, the intelligent and spirited second daughter of a country gentleman, and the wealthy but aloof Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy. The narrative primarily concerns the obstacles to true love and understanding faced by the young couple, including issues of class, marriage, morality, and personal pride and prejudice. Elizabeth's lively intelligence and sharp tongue contrast with Darcy's initially haughty demeanor, and much of the plot involves their movement from mutual disdain to love and respect. Austen's incisive humor and social commentary give the novel its enduring appeal. She deftly critiques the social hierarchy of the time and the constraints placed upon women in her society, while also crafting a compelling romantic plot that has delighted readers for over 2 centuries. The novel's enduring popularity has led to numerous adaptations in film, television, and literature, making characters like Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy familiar to millions around the world.
If you enjoy this content, please take a minute to like, subscribe, or share this video. You can also hit the bell to be notified of new classic books reimagined as soon as they are published here on YouTube.
Part 1. Chapter 1. New Neighbours and Old Dreams. In the small, picturesque town of Fairview, where the sun kissed the green meadows with a golden glow, and the local diner buzzed with daily gossip, everyone knew everyone else's business, especially when it came to newcomers. It was a universally accepted fact among the residents that a wealthy bachelor moving into town was in desperate need of a wife. Lila Bennet, with her long, honey-blonde hair, usually pulled back in a practical ponytail, often mused over this with her husband while sipping sweet tea on their porch. The day they learned about the new tenant at the grand estate of Netherfield, her curiosity couldn't be contained. "Jake, darling," Lila said, her eyes bright with excitement, "did you hear that Netherfield has finally found a new owner?" Jake Bennet, who had been engrossed in his morning paper, looked over the rim of his glasses. "Can't say that I have, hun." "Well, it has," she exclaimed, her bracelets jingling as she gestured animatedly. "Sue Ellen from down the street was just over, and she couldn't stop talking about it." Jake, ever the quiet listener, nodded for her to continue. "Aren't you just dying to know who's taken it?" Lila asked, barely containing her eagerness. "You seem eager enough for both of us," Jake replied with a smile, his tone light and teasing. Lila laughed, the sound as bright as the chimes swaying in the southern breeze. "Well, let me fill you in then. It's been rented by a young man named Charles Bingley from up north. Rich, unmarried, and handsome, or so I hear. Drove down here in a sleek black Cadillac just last Monday, saw the place, and fell head over heels for it. He's moving in before the fall, and his staff will start arriving next week." "And what's the gentleman's name?" Jake asked, already knowing what the answer would be. "Bingley, Charles Bingley, and guess what? He's single." Jake raised an eyebrow. "And that's a fine thing for our girls." Lila's eyes sparkled with mischief and matchmaking plans. Imagine if he took a liking to one of them. What an establishment it would be. Jake shook his head, a wry smile playing on his lips. "Lila, do you really think he's moving here with marriage on his mind?" "Oh, don't be such a pessimist. But even if he isn't looking for a bride right this second, who's to say he won't fall head over boots for one of our daughters? So, you will go welcome him to Fairview, won't you?" "I reckon I might," Jake mused. "But you know, you and the girls might stand a better chance without me. I wouldn't want to steal your spotlight." Lila tapped him playfully on the arm. "Now, don't you start with your flattery. Sure, I had my days in the sun, but I'm just a mother of 5 beautiful girls now. It's their time to shine." "As long as you don't go promising any of them to him without their say-so," Jake added, his tone turning a bit more serious. Lila nodded, the seriousness of her husband's words tempering her excitement slightly. "Of course, love. but a mother can dream, can't she? They both knew Lila would be over at Netherfield as soon as Mr. Bingley settled in, if only to satisfy her own curiosity, and perhaps, with a bit of southern charm, play Cupid for their daughters. As they sipped their tea, watching the sun climb higher in the sky, the day seemed filled with possibilities. Chapter 2. A Dance and a Dilemma. The Bennet household was abuzz with activity, set against the backdrop of the rustic town of Fairview, where the community's social calendar revolved around the local assembly's dances and the occasional grand opening of a new boutique. On this particular day, the family found themselves embroiled in a spirited discussion that veered from hopeful plans to playful banter. Jake Bennet, known for his calm demeanour and a penchant for surprising his family with unexpected news, had just returned from a visit to the newly arrived Charles Bingley at Netherfield. The revelation came as he watched his second daughter, Lizzie, meticulously adorning a stylish cowboy hat with vibrant feathers and beads. "I hope Mr. Bingley will like it, Lizzie," Jake commented casually, sparking a flurry of reactions. Lila Bennet, always one to keep track of potential suitors for her daughters, responded with a mix of irritation and disbelief. "We wouldn't know what Mr. Bingley likes, since we haven't been over to visit yet." Lizzie, without looking up from her crafting, replied, "Don't worry, Mama. We'll meet him at the upcoming dance. Sue Ellen Long promised she'd introduce us." Lila scoffed, her scepticism as vivid as the red lipstick she favoured. "Sue Ellen won't do any such thing. She's too busy promoting her own nieces. That woman has never put anyone else before her family." Jake, inserting a gentle chuckle, added, "And that's why we shouldn't count on her. It's better not to depend too much on others' promises." Their conversation was momentarily interrupted by Kitty, the youngest daughter, who was struggling with a persistent cough. "For heaven's sake, Kitty, try to cough quietly. Think of my nerves," Lila exclaimed, her voice a blend of concern and exasperation. Kitty, looking slightly affronted, muttered, "I don't cough for fun, you know." The talk then turned back to the upcoming dance. "It's set for 2 weeks from now," Lizzie confirmed, her voice bright with anticipation. "That's right," Lila remembered, "and Sue Ellen won't be back until the day before. There's no way she can introduce Mr. Bingley to us properly." Jake, with a twinkle in his eye, suggested, "Then, Lizzie, maybe you can introduce Mr. Bingley to Sue Ellen instead. It might give you the upper hand." Lila looked at her husband, puzzled and a bit annoyed. "Jake, how can you tease at a time like this?" "I'm just saying that if we don't take the initiative, someone else will," Jake explained with a smile. "And I've already made our acquaintance with Mr. Bingley, so there's no avoiding him now." The room filled with a mix of shock and excitement at Jake's revelation. Lila, once she recovered from her initial surprise, beamed at her husband. "How clever of you, dear. I knew you'd come through for the girls. What a wonderful joke you've played, keeping it a secret all this while." Jake, satisfied with the stir he'd caused, quipped to Kitty, "Now you can cough as much as you like," before excusing himself from the room, leaving the women to ponder their next moves. Lila, ever the proud matriarch, declared, "What an excellent father you have. It's not easy at our age to be making new friends, but for you girls, we'd do anything." Lydia, the boldest of the sisters, chimed in confidently, "I'm not worried. Even though I'm the youngest, I'm sure Mr. Bingley will dance with me at the ball. I'm the tallest, after all." The evening waned with the Bennets speculating on when Mr. Bingley might return Jake's visit, and when they might extend an invitation for dinner, each discussion infused with the warmth and vibrancy typical of a close-knit family eagerly awaiting new beginnings. Chapter 3. The Ball at Fairview. In the charming town of Fairview, excitement bubbled like a pot of sweet tea left too long on the stove, especially in the Bennet household. Despite their efforts, Lila Bennet and her 5 daughters couldn't coax Jake Bennet into revealing much about Charles Bingley, the charming newcomer. Instead, they had to rely on snippets from their neighbour, Carol Lucas, whose glowing praise of Mr. Bingley only fanned the flames of curiosity and speculation. Carol's account left no room for doubt. Charles Bingley was as handsome as he was sociable, and he promised to attend the upcoming Fairview dance with a large party. The news spread like wildfire, igniting dreams of romantic dances and heartfelt conversations. "If only one of my girls finds happiness at Netherfield," Lila confided to Jake one evening as they watched the sunset from their porch, "then truly, my heart would want for nothing more." When Mr. Bingley returned Jake's visit, the ladies of the house could only catch a glimpse of him through an upstairs window, noting his stylish blue blazer and the sleek black horse he rode. Despite their disappointment at not meeting him, plans buzzed through the Bennet home, with Lila orchestrating a feast that would showcase her culinary prowess. But fate intervened. Mr. Bingley had to postpone, citing urgent business in the city, leaving the Bennets to ponder his hectic lifestyle. Carol Lucas suggested that Mr. Bingley's trip might be to gather friends for the ball, and soon enough word came that he would bring a sizable entourage. Though initially dismayed by the number of ladies he planned to bring, the Bennet sisters found relief when only 6 arrived, his 5 sisters and a cousin. The final party that entered the ballroom was an intimate group: Mr. Bingley, his 2 sisters, 1 brother-in-law and a friend, none other than the enigmatic Mr. Darcy. Charles Bingley, with his easy smile and engaging manners, quickly became the life of the party. He danced every dance, his laughter ringing clear, and even expressed regret when the evening ended too soon. His friend, however, Mr. Darcy, with his tall frame and handsome features, initially caught the attendees' attention until his aloofness and apparent disdain for the assembly soured opinions. Elizabeth Bennet, one of the middle Bennet sisters, known for her wit and vivacity, found herself sitting out despite the attention her beauty garnered. During one of these moments, she overheard Mr. Bingley trying to coax Mr. Darcy onto the dance floor. "Come, Darcy, you must dance. It's dreadful to see you so standoffish," Bingley chided. Darcy's reply was cutting. "I certainly shall not. Unless I am particularly acquainted with someone, I find it insufferable. There's not a woman here I'd deem suitable." Despite Bingley's protest that there were many attractive and pleasant women present, Darcy dismissed them all, including Elizabeth, with a mere, "She is tolerable, but not tempting enough." Stung by his words, Elizabeth shared this snub with her friends, turning the slight into a humorous anecdote that showcased her resilience and spirit. As the night drew to a close, the Bennets returned home in high spirits. Lila bubbled with excitement over the attention Jane, the eldest, received from Mr. Bingley, while the other sisters revelled in their own delightful experiences. Even the usually reserved Mary was pleased to hear herself praised by Miss Bingley. Upon their return, Lila eagerly recounted the evening's triumphs to Jake, who had stayed behind, immersed in his books. "Jane was so admired, and Mr. Bingley danced with her twice," she exclaimed. Jake, half amused and half exhausted by the tale, jokingly lamented, "If only Mr. Bingley had sprained his ankle early on, sparing me the details of every dance." As Lila continued, she couldn't help but lament the unfortunate impression Mr. Darcy had made. "Such a disagreeable man," she declared, "not worth pleasing at all." And with the echoes of the dance still buzzing through their minds, the Bennets ended the evening full of anticipation and a few new tales of heartache and humour, ready to see what new dramas the next gathering would bring in the lively dance of life in Fairview. Chapter 4: Heartfelt Confessions and Family Ties. In the cosy living room of the Bennet family home, nestled in the heart of Fairview, Jane and Elizabeth Bennet found a quiet moment away from the hustle and bustle of their lively household. The walls, adorned with family portraits and handmade quilts, echoed with the warmth of many generations. As they settled into the plush comfort of an old floral sofa, the conversation naturally turned to the recent ball, and, more specifically, to Charles Bingley, whose presence had lit up the event. Jane, her cheeks still flushed with the excitement and flattery of the evening, turned to her sister with a sparkle in her eyes. "Charles Bingley is everything a gentleman should be," she began, her voice tinged with admiration. "He's sensible, good-humoured, and so full of life. And his manners are impeccable, so at ease, yet perfectly polite." Elizabeth, always keen and observant, smiled at her sister's enthusiasm. "He's quite handsome too," she added playfully, "which certainly doesn't hurt his charm. His character seems quite complete to me." Jane nodded, a gentle blush colouring her cheeks. "I was truly flattered when he asked me to dance a second time. It was unexpected, but such a lovely compliment." "Really, Jane? I expected it, given how you outshone everyone else in the room," Elizabeth teased, her tone light but sincere. "Compliments may surprise you, dear sister, but I see them as only natural. Mr. Bingley seemed quite taken by your beauty and grace." Jane laughed softly, her eyes reflecting a mix of joy and incredulity. "Oh, Lizzie, you think too well of me. You know I tend to see the best in people. I can't help it. I never seem to find fault with anyone." "And that's what makes you remarkable," Elizabeth responded, her voice warm with affection. "Your genuine kindness and candour are rare qualities. And what about Mr. Bingley's sisters? Did you like them as well?" "At first I wasn't sure," Jane admitted, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "But they seemed quite pleasant once I got to know them a bit. Miss Bingley especially will be staying with her brother and managing his household. I think she might turn out to be a charming neighbour." Elizabeth listened thoughtfully, but remained unconvinced. Her sharper eye for detail and less pliable nature had given her a different impression at the assembly. The Bingley sisters, though undoubtedly refined and well-educated, had struck her as somewhat aloof and overly conscious of their own status. They seemed to carry an air of pride that bordered on conceit, a trait not uncommon among those of their considerable wealth and social standing. The conversation shifted as the sisters discussed Mr. Bingley's circumstances. He had inherited a substantial fortune from his father, who had passed before purchasing an estate. Though now just a tenant at Netherfield, Charles seemed content, leaving some to wonder if he would ever take the step to establish a more permanent home. His friendship with Mr. Darcy was a study in contrasts. Where Bingley was open and approachable, Darcy was reserved and discerning, often coming off as aloof or haughty. Yet it was clear that Bingley valued Darcy's judgment and relied on his friend's wisdom. As the sisters delved deeper into their discussion, they contrasted Bingley's genuine affability at the assembly with Darcy's more reserved demeanour. Charles had found the locals warm and engaging, making fast friends throughout the evening, while Darcy had held back, finding little to interest him and remaining distant. Mr. Darcy did acknowledge Jane's beauty, though he thought she smiled too much, Elizabeth recalled with a slight frown. Jane, ever the peacemaker, suggested, "Perhaps he's simply more reserved, and we need to understand him better." Elizabeth nodded, knowing her sister's sweet nature hoped for the best. The evening wound down with the sisters, feeling a mix of anticipation and caution, their hearts and minds alive with the possibilities that new acquaintances might bring to their close-knit family life in Fairview. Chapter 5. Post-ball whispers and witty exchanges. In the cosy community of Fairview, just a stone's throw from the Bennet family farm, stood Lucas Lodge. The residence, set amid sprawling oak trees, was the home of Sir William Lucas, a man of considerable charm and hospitality who had once been a prominent merchant in nearby Meryton. After a successful career, he had been knighted for his service to the community during his term as mayor. The honour had spurred him to leave commerce behind, and he had moved his family to the more prestigious setting of Lucas Lodge, where he relished his role as a retired gentleman. The Lucas family was particularly close to the Bennets, and Charlotte Lucas, a sensible and sharp-witted young woman of 27, was Elizabeth Bennet's dearest friend. Their friendship was rooted in a shared love for candid conversations and a keen observation of social nuances. The morning after the Meryton Assembly, Charlotte and her siblings made their way to the Bennet household, eager to exchange details and opinions about the previous evening's events. The air was crisp, hinting at the approach of autumn, and the crunch of leaves underfoot seemed to echo the crackling excitement as they entered the Bennets' sunlit parlour. Lila Bennet greeted them with a warm, if somewhat pointed, compliment. "Charlotte, you began the evening splendidly," she said, with a mix of genuine admiration and strategic flattery. "Mr. Bingley chose you for the first dance, I recall." Charlotte, who was more amused than impressed by such distinctions, replied with a laugh, "Yes, but it seems he preferred his second partner far more." Lila, ever hopeful for her daughter's prospects, couldn't help but interject, "You mean Jane, of course. He danced with her twice. It certainly looked like he admired her. Indeed, I heard as much from various sources, though the details escape me now." Charlotte, with a playful glint in her eye, shared a tidbit she had overheard. "Well, Mr. Robinson asked him how he liked our local gatherings and if he found the ladies to our liking. Mr. Bingley didn't hesitate to declare Jane the fairest of all, a sentiment that seemed unanimous." Lila clapped her hands together, delighted yet cautious. "Well, that is quite decisive, but of course we mustn't get ahead of ourselves." The conversation took a turn when Charlotte mentioned Mr. Darcy, whose aloof demeanour had sparked less favourable gossip. "Eliza got the short end of the stick with Mr. Darcy, I'm afraid. He deemed her merely tolerable." Elizabeth, who had been quietly sipping her tea, chimed in with a wry smile. "Charlotte, please don't stir Mother up by suggesting I should be vexed. Mr. Darcy's indifference is a blessing in disguise. Imagine being favoured by such a disagreeable man." The room burst into laughter, but Jane, ever the peacemaker, raised a question. "Are we certain of his disposition? Miss Bingley mentioned that he's quite pleasant in familiar company." Lila waved a dismissive hand. "If he were truly agreeable, he would have been charming to all, carriage or no carriage. His pride is well known, and I suspect it keeps him from being more sociable." Charlotte nodded, understanding the nuances of social status and its impacts. "His pride doesn't bother me as much, given his standing. It's almost expected, though not always excusable." Elizabeth's thoughtful expression reflected her internal debate. "I could forgive his pride if it hadn't wounded my own." Their sister Mary, always eager to contribute philosophically, added, "Pride is a common human failing. It's often our self-regard that blinds us, not our vanity, which concerns how others see us." The morning's discussion took a lighter turn when young Tommy Lucas, who had tagged along, declared with the certainty of youth, "If I were as rich as Mr. Darcy, I'd live a life of luxury and care for nothing else." Lila responded with a mix of humour and reprimand. "And you'd likely overindulge, to which I'd have to put a stop." Their laughter and spirited debates filled the room until the Lucases prepared to leave, their visit ending on a note of jovial contention about youthful ambitions and the complex dance of social graces. As they departed, the Bennet sisters reflected on the tangled web of relationships and reputations that governed their social world, each conversation adding layers to their understanding and anticipation of what was yet to unfold in Fairview. Chapter 6. Unspoken Attractions and Social Gambits. In the quaint town of Fairview, after the much-talked-about assembly, the Bennet ladies paid a visit to the stately Netherfield, the temporary home of Mr. Charles Bingley and his sisters. This gracious gesture was warmly reciprocated by the residents of Netherfield. Despite the mixed impressions from the assembly, Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley found themselves increasingly charmed by Jane Bennet's amiable nature. Unfortunately, their opinion of Mrs. Bennet and the younger Bennet sisters was less favourable, yet they expressed a keen interest in getting better acquainted with Jane and Elizabeth. Jane was delighted by their attention, appreciating the warmth they extended, suspecting it sprang from Mr. Bingley's obvious admiration. Elizabeth, however, remained sceptical of their sincerity, perceiving a hint of condescension in their behaviour that seemed to spare no one, not even Jane. Despite this, she acknowledged the strategic importance of their kindness, attributing it to their brother's influence. Elizabeth shared her observations with Charlotte Lucas during a leisurely walk through the vibrant fall foliage around Lucas Lodge. Jane seems quite taken with Mr. Bingley, and it's clear he's quite smitten with her too, she commented, watching a pair of leaves drift to the ground. Charlotte, ever pragmatic, responded thoughtfully. It's clever to keep such affections hidden from public scrutiny, but sometimes being too guarded can be a disadvantage. Jane needs to ensure Mr. Bingley knows of her interest, subtly of course, or she might miss her chance. Elizabeth chuckled softly. Oh, Charlotte, Jane is as transparent as this crisp autumn air. If I can see her affection, surely Mr. Bingley, unless completely oblivious, must notice it too. But you know him far less than you know Jane, Charlotte pointed out, and their interactions are brief, always in such crowded settings. She must seize every moment to capture his attention fully. True, but Jane isn't one to orchestrate her actions so calculatingly, Elizabeth replied, a hint of pride in her voice. She's genuine in her feelings, and that's a rarity worth more than any strategic affection. Charlotte sighed, a slight smile playing on her lips. I do hope for her happiness, Elizabeth. Quick attachments can be as profound as those long considered. After all, happiness in marriage is often a matter of chance rather than careful planning. Their conversation was interrupted as they neared the Lucas Lodge, where a large social gathering was taking place. Sir William Lucas, ever the congenial host, was welcoming guests with his usual affable cheer. The atmosphere was lively, filled with the soft strumming of a guitar and the gentle laughter of friends and neighbours. It was here that Elizabeth unwittingly became the subject of a certain gentleman's interest. Mr. Darcy, who had initially dismissed Elizabeth at the assembly, found himself increasingly intrigued by her wit and expressive eyes. As the evening progressed, his initial indifference transformed into a reluctant admiration. Observing her lively interactions, he began to appreciate her unguarded manner and the intelligent sparkle in her eyes. "What is Mr. Darcy up to, listening so intently to our conversation?" Elizabeth whispered to Charlotte, after noticing his attention. "Only Mr. Darcy can answer that," Charlotte whispered back with a knowing smile. Determined not to be outdone by his silent scrutiny, Elizabeth turned to him with playful defiance. "Mr. Darcy, did you not find my remarks on organising another ball quite eloquent?" Darcy, caught off guard but amused, replied, "Indeed, you spoke with great enthusiasm, a topic that always seems to invigorate ladies." Elizabeth, not missing a beat, retorted, "You seem quite critical of our enthusiasms." As the evening unfolded, Sir William attempted to coax Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy into dancing. Elizabeth, however, firmly declined, not wishing to appear eager for his company. Despite her refusal, Darcy's interest was piqued, and he watched her with a mixture of admiration and curiosity, his earlier reservations slowly giving way to a grudging respect for her spirited nature. The night continued with music and merriment, but the undercurrents of attraction and social manoeuvring added a layer of complexity to the festive gathering. As Elizabeth played the piano, her performance, though not flawless, was received with greater appreciation than the technically superior but less spirited play of her sister Mary. The evening at Lucas Lodge revealed not just the social dynamics of Fairview, but also hinted at deeper, unspoken connections forming beneath the surface. Chapter 7. Family Ties and Malicious Wounds. In the heart of Fairview, the Bennet family farm thrived modestly, but the land and home they cherished were entangled in the complexities of an inheritance tied strictly to male succession. Mr. Bennet's annual income, derived from this estate, was substantial yet precarious, given that in the absence of a male heir, it would pass to a distant cousin. Mrs. Bennet's own inheritance, though adequate, could not compensate for the potential financial instability this entailment posed. Mrs. Bennet, who came from a family of legal professionals in nearby Meryton, had a sister married to Mr. Phillips, a once humble clerk who had ascended to running her late father's firm, and a brother who had found moderate success in London's bustling commercial scene. The proximity of Longbourn to Meryton, a mere mile, made it a frequent destination for the younger Bennets, especially Catherine and Lydia, whose interests often led them to the local shops and their aunt's cosy, gossip-filled drawing-room. Lately, Meryton had been buzzing with excitement over the wintering of a militia regiment, making the town a canvas of redcoats and gallant manners, much to the delight of the younger Miss Bennets. Visits to Aunt Phillips became eagerly anticipated events, as they provided the sisters not only with familiar warmth, but thrilling updates on the handsome officers stationed nearby. One crisp morning, after a particularly animated discussion about the dashing militia officers, Mr. Bennet dryly commented on his youngest daughter's fancies. "It seems, from your endless chatter about redcoats, that I've raised the silliest girls in the county." Lydia, ever bold and unbothered, shrugged off her father's words and continued to gush about Captain Carter, whom she hoped to see before his imminent departure to London. Mrs. Bennet, slightly affronted yet spirited, chided her husband. "Oh, Mr. Bennet, to think so little of your own daughters. Remember, even you once admired the allure of a uniform." Mr. Bennet's reply was tinged with irony. "Indeed I did, and should a wealthy colonel propose, I might not object, though it seems our girls fancy any officer, regardless of his fortune." As their banter continued, a note arrived for Jane from Netherfield, delivered by a servant who awaited her response. Mrs. Bennet's excitement was palpable, her questions tumbling out rapidly as Jane read aloud Miss Bingley's urgent invitation, hinting at domestic boredom and a playful threat of eternal quarrels if Jane declined her company. Lydia's interest piqued at the mention of the officers, but it was Jane's potential evening at Netherfield that dominated the conversation. The weather, looking ominous, prompted Mrs. Bennet to suggest Jane ride horseback, ensuring she'd have to stay overnight due to the rain, a subtle manoeuvre that might extend her daughter's presence at Netherfield. Elizabeth, concerned but amused by her mother's scheming, watched as the day unfolded exactly as Mrs. Bennet had hoped. Jane left on horseback, and soon after, the skies opened. By evening, it was clear Jane wouldn't return, and Mrs. Bennet revelled in her successful, if manipulative, planning. The following day brought news of Jane's illness from her overnight exposure. Elizabeth, determined and headstrong, decided to walk the 3 miles to Netherfield, dismissing the muddy roads and weather in her resolve to see her sister. Her arrival, muddied and flushed from her exertions, caused a stir among the Netherfield party. Her dishevelled appearance was met with concealed disdain from Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst, but with a kind of admiring astonishment from Mr. Bingley, and a puzzled interest from Mr. Darcy. Jane, though unwell, was overjoyed at Elizabeth's arrival. The sisters' bond was evident as Elizabeth attended to Jane, their closeness drawing even a grudging respect from those at Netherfield who had initially judged Elizabeth's unconventional arrival. As Elizabeth was preparing to leave later that day, Miss Bingley, seeing the genuine distress it caused Jane, quickly extended an invitation for Elizabeth to stay, which she gratefully accepted. A servant was dispatched to Longbourn to inform the family and fetch a change of clothes for an unexpected extended stay, marking another chapter in the evolving relationships between the Bennet sisters and the intriguing inhabitants of Netherfield. Chapter 8. Unspoken Concerns and Social Charades. In the tranquil settings of Netherfield, an estate marked by its genteel opulence and sprawling grounds, Elizabeth Bennet found herself caught in a whirlwind of social expectations and personal concerns. As the clock struck 5, she and her ailing sister Jane prepared for the evening, their thoughts far from the opulent dinner table they were soon to join. By 6:30, Elizabeth descended the grand staircase, her dress a simple yet elegant affair, contrasting sharply with the more elaborate gowns of her hosts. Her entrance into the dining room was met with a flurry of polite inquiries about Jane's health, to which Elizabeth responded with reserved candour. Jane was not improving. The Bingley sisters expressed a rehearsed sympathy, their words echoing concern, but their quick dismissal of the subject revealing a stark indifference once Jane was out of sight. Charles Bingley's genuine worry for Jane was the sole comfort to Elizabeth, offering a sincere contrast to his sister's superficial condolences. His attentions made the dinner bearable for Elizabeth, who otherwise felt isolated amidst the glittering but cold company. Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst were preoccupied with Mr. Darcy, while Mr. Hurst, seated next to Elizabeth, showed interest only in his meal and the card games to follow, barely engaging with her beyond a comment on her preference for simpler dishes. Post-dinner, Elizabeth promptly returned to Jane's side, leaving the others to their private censures. In her absence, Miss Bingley wasted no time disparaging Elizabeth's morning appearance and her audacious walk through the mud, an act they deemed a glaring lapse in decorum. "Her petticoat 6 inches deep in mud," Miss Bingley scoffed, her voice dripping with disdain. "She looked almost wild," added Mrs. Hurst, further criticising Elizabeth's lack of style and grace. Yet, in the privacy of their discussion, Charles Bingley remained unswayed by his sister's harsh judgments. "I thought Miss Elizabeth looked remarkably well," he countered, his admiration for her spirit undiminished by her soiled attire. Mr. Darcy, though less vocal, did not dismiss Elizabeth's appeal so quickly, noting instead the brightened expression her brisk walk had lent her. The conversation shifted towards the Bennets' modest social standing, a topic that elicited sneers from Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst, but a more measured response from Darcy. The mention of the Bennets' humble relatives only served to amuse the sisters further, yet Bingley pointed out, if they had uncles enough to fill all Cheapside, it would not make them one jot less agreeable. However, Darcy's realism pierced the mirth with a reminder of the harsh judgments of society, suggesting that such connections might indeed affect the sisters' prospects among the gentry. Later, as the party adjourned to the drawing-room for coffee and cards, Elizabeth, ever the attentive sister, declined to join in the gambling, preferring instead to stay close to a bookshelf. The conversation soon turned to accomplishments and the qualities of an ideal woman. Miss Bingley and Darcy debated the merits of various accomplishments, with Darcy outlining a daunting list of attributes that defined a truly accomplished woman, a standard so high that Elizabeth mockingly doubted any woman could meet it. The evening wore on with Elizabeth increasingly torn between her role as Jane's caregiver and her presence among the Netherfield guests. Her brief forays into the group discussions revealed the stark contrast in their values and her own. As she finally excused herself to return to Jane's side, the voices of Bingley's sisters faded behind her, their words a blend of false pity and veiled contempt for the Bennet family's less distinguished connections. As night deepened over Netherfield, Elizabeth was left to ponder the genuine kindness Charles Bingley had shown and the curious, unsettling interest Mr. Darcy seemed to harbour. In the quiet of Jane's sick room, these thoughts mingled with her worries, casting long shadows over her hopes for her sister's quick recovery. Chapter 9. Sisterly Devotion and Social Intrigues. In the comforting yet complex atmosphere of Netherfield, Elizabeth Bennet found herself navigating a landscape filled with social expectations, while her primary concern remained the health of her sister Jane. The night had been spent in anxious vigil by Jane's bedside, and as dawn broke, Elizabeth was relieved to report a slight improvement in her sister's condition to an earnest Mr. Bingley, who inquired after Jane through a housemaid. Despite this positive turn, Elizabeth, ever cautious, requested a note be sent to their mother at Longbourn, urging her to come and see Jane for herself. Mrs. Bennet, always ready to be at the heart of family matters, arrived post-haste with her 2 youngest daughters, Kitty and Lydia, trailing excitement and youthful curiosity in their wake. Upon their arrival, Mrs. Bennet's initial fears were calmed by Jane's appearance, which, though still unwell, was not as dire as she had feared. With a mix of maternal relief and strategic foresight, Mrs. Bennet declined the suggestion of taking Jane home. Her convalescence at Netherfield would, after all, prolong their stay under the same roof as Mr. Bingley, a connection Mrs. Bennet was keen to cultivate. During a polite exchange in the breakfast parlour, where the Bennet ladies were invited after visiting Jane, Mrs. Bennet artfully implied Jane's illness required an extended stay. "She's far too ill to be moved, Mr. Bingley. We mustn't think of it," she declared, with a calculated blend of concern and manipulation, ensuring their host knew they were at his family's mercy. Charles Bingley, ever the gracious host, was quick to reassure. "There's absolutely no thought of sending her away. We are more than capable of caring for Miss Bennet here," he affirmed, a statement echoed by Miss Bingley, though her civility carried a chill that Elizabeth felt keenly. As Mrs. Bennet lavished praise on the Bingleys' hospitality, Elizabeth's thoughts lingered on the stark contrast between her mother's effusive manners and the more measured warmth from Charles Bingley. His concern seemed genuine, a rarity among the polite facades often encountered in their social circles. The conversation soon drifted towards the merits of country versus city life, spurred by Mrs. Bennet's pointed commentary. Darcy's preference for the variety found in town was misconstrued by Mrs. Bennet as a slight against country society, leading to a spirited defence of their rural lifestyle. Bingley, attempting to bridge his affections for both settings, remarked, "Each has its charm, and I am content in either." As the visit wore on, Lydia, ever bold and buoyed by her mother's audacity, seized a moment to remind Bingley of a past promise to host a ball. Her directness was a breath of fresh air in the often stifling formality of their gatherings. Bingley's response was both charming and diplomatic, ensuring Lydia that a ball would certainly be held once Jane recovered. This promise delighted Lydia, who was already imagining the event as the social highlight of the season. The morning's interactions were a delicate dance of social niceties and hidden agendas. Elizabeth observed these dynamics with a critical eye, her respect for Bingley growing as he navigated his sister's less than welcoming attitudes and his own inclinations with grace. Yet, it was Darcy's quiet observance and occasional contributions that puzzled her most, his demeanour hinting at depths not yet explored. Upon the Bennets' departure, Elizabeth quickly returned to Jane's side, her thoughts a whirl of concern for her sister and contemplation of the intricate social web at Netherfield. Each encounter, each exchanged glance, and each spoken word added layers to her understanding of the Bingley siblings and Mr. Darcy, whose enigmatic presence continued to challenge her perceptions. Chapter 10. Undercurrents at Netherfield. The day unfolded under the stately roof of Netherfield, much like the previous one, but with the quiet tension of its genteel inhabitants becoming more pronounced. After a restless night spent at her sister Jane's side, Elizabeth was relieved to report a slight improvement in her condition to an eager Mr. Bingley through a diligent housemaid early in the morning. His sisters, upon visiting, expressed a brief and polished concern before retreating to their own pursuits. Mrs. Bennet, accompanied by Kitty and Lydia, arrived at Netherfield shortly after breakfast, her maternal anxieties palpable, yet tinged with a strategic reluctance to hasten Jane's recovery and their return to Longbourn. Upon confirming Jane was in no immediate danger, Mrs. Bennet's relief was visible, though she cunningly hid it behind a mask of continued worry. "Mr. Bingley," Mrs. Bennet began as she entered the drawing-room where Mr. Bingley awaited them, "I fear our stay may extend a bit longer. Jane is far too weak for removal, according to Mr. Jones." Bingley, ever the gracious host, quickly reassured her. "Please, think nothing of it, Mrs. Bennet. We are more than prepared to have you as long as necessary. The comfort of your daughter is our utmost concern." Miss Bingley, with a less sincere undertone, added, "Indeed, Mrs. Bennet, we are fully at your disposal. Your daughter's well-being is paramount, and we shall ensure she receives all due attention." Grateful, if slightly sceptical of Miss Bingley's warmth, Mrs. Bennet responded, "That is most kind, and I must say, your hospitality does you credit. This lovely home, this delightful room, it's quite the haven for recovery." As evening approached and they gathered in the drawing room, the typical card table was notably absent. Mr. Darcy was preoccupied with a letter, his attention occasionally stolen by Miss Bingley, who seemed determined to engage him in trivial conversation. "You write with such eloquence, Mr. Darcy. Miss Darcy will cherish every word," Miss Bingley remarked, leaning closer to glance at the script that flowed from his pen. Darcy, maintaining his usual reserve, responded without looking up, "Thank you, Miss Bingley. I strive for clarity and brevity in my correspondence." "And yet your letters carry such depth. How do you manage to write so quickly and yet so well?" she continued, her admiration bordering on flattery. "I'm afraid you overestimate my abilities. I assure you my writing speed is quite average," Darcy replied, his focus unswerving. Elizabeth, observing this interaction from her place by the window, found herself both amused and intrigued by the dynamics at play. Her hands worked automatically on her embroidery, her mind weaving through the subtleties of the conversation. As Mr. Hurst and Mr. Bingley engaged in their game of piquet, Mr. Bingley's laughter punctuated the quiet tension, providing a cheerful counterpoint to Darcy's stoic demeanour. Mrs. Hurst, seemingly content to watch the game, offered occasional praise for her husband's strategic plays. Later, as Elizabeth joined her family at the table, the conversation naturally drifted towards the preferences between town and country life. Mr. Bingley extolled the virtues of both, his diplomatic reply highlighting his ease in any setting. "The countryside provides a peace that the city cannot match, yet the city offers a pulse, a vitality that is equally enchanting," Bingley explained, his eyes briefly meeting Elizabeth's, seeking her agreement. Darcy, however, offered a more critical view, suggesting that the variety of society in the city far surpassed that of the country, prompting a spirited defence from Mrs. Bennet. "Now, Mr. Darcy, surely you must admit there's as much society to be found here in the country as in any city," Mrs. Bennet asserted, her tone both challenging and playful. The evening wound down with discussions of literary tastes and personal accomplishments, revealing the varied expectations each held for accomplished individuals. Darcy's remarks on the qualities of an accomplished woman sparked a lively debate, with Elizabeth challenging his stringent criteria. "Surely, Mr. Darcy, you don't believe that such perfection truly exists? To meet all your standards would be a Herculean task for any woman," Elizabeth teased, her eyes twinkling with provocation. Darcy, uncharacteristically, was momentarily at a loss, his usual composure slipping as he met her gaze. "Miss Bennet, I must confess, your argument gives me much to consider," he admitted, his voice tinged with respect. As the group dispersed for the night, Elizabeth felt the complex interplay of personalities at Netherfield drawing her deeper into a social labyrinth that was as fascinating as it was bewildering. She retired to her sister's side, her thoughts a blend of concern for Jane and reflective amusement at the day's interactions.
This is the end of part 1 of Pride and Prejudice, reimagined in the style of best-selling romance author Carolyn Brown. Please take a moment to like and subscribe. You can hear the rest of this story by following along in the Pride and Prejudice playlist on the Classic Books Reimagined channel. If you have an idea for a classic book you would like to hear as reimagined through the style of a modern author, please leave it in the comments. We will see you soon for part 2.